Now, what if you would have walked up to him and shot him again, thinking that he was still alive?
I was convinced for the longest time that I was, leaving that woods without a deer again.
Facing right where she came through, and I was like, man, if there's a buck chasing her, like, I'm shooting this thing straight down.
I think we get too wrapped up with trail camera pictures and when to be into an area based off of trail cameras. And
All right, guys. This is Mike here. Who else we got around the table? Someone over there jingling his keys, we know.
Brian.
Got Brian here.
Jed.
Nate?
All right. So we're going to talk some archery stuff today. We are almost at the end of November here, and we are racking up some taxidermy bills, which is a good thing, I guess,
And a
kind
bad
of.
thing.
But I know I'm going to have to probably get a second job here soon. I got Allison's racking up quite the taxidermy bill on her own. So, but we got a couple stories to tell here, and who wants to start?
I'll start. I think I was the first one this year to kill a buck.
Oh, yeah, okay. Mr. First One.
Yeah.
Slow clap for Brian.
But yeah, so the deer I ended up killing this year was a buck I had a little bit of history with. I first saw him 2 years ago. He was an 8-point, and he had, his G3s were little crab claws out at the end. But he had a real nice frame on him, and he came in into like 7 yards at a scrape, and I just ended up videotaping him and figured, heck, I'll try to let him live to see if it happens or not. But, we do have tons of pressure around us, and, he happened to make it that year into next year. And that year, the year I saw him, he had a wound across the top of his back, and I don't know if it was an antler wound or what it was. But the following year, I got pictures of him in the right around August, I think August. I started getting pictures of him, and he was a 7-point this year, and I could tell it was the same deer because he had that scar that was going across his back. So from there, very few pictures of him in daylight after he got hard-horned, and saw him a few times out in this one bedding area that I'm able to hunt, and but never had him anywhere close enough to shoot. And finally, we had an east wind the one night, and I got into this old crabapple orchard and hunted really, really low to the ground. I was only probably about 6 to 8 feet up, and here he came through behind a doe, and this was late October, and he was like 27 yards, and I needed him to be about 25 yards, and never got a shot at him. So the very last day of the archery muzzleloader season in Pennsylvania, he got hit by my cousin, and with a crossbow, way up high, and went through the back straps actually, and he ended up surviving again. But yeah, so this year he ended up being a big 9-point, big mainframe 9. So, anyways, had him early on again. This year, just tons of photos of this deer. And he was running with another big 12-point.
You're thinking he's how old this year now?
I believe he's 5.5 this year. 4.5 at the earliest, or at the youngest. And again, he started daylighting way more this year. I had a camera just right on the edge of the bedding area, and what he was doing, he was coming out, and there's an apple tree there, and he was staging up on that apple tree, and then heading out into the crop fields. But I will say, my camera wasn't getting him. It went dead for how long, Nate? Probably 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. My camera just went completely dead. And so the one evening, we had a favorable wind to go in there and hunt. And I went in there, and I was going to pull the camera and get set up on him. Well, as I was walking in, there he was, literally 30 yards behind my camera on the other apple tree. And what happened was the apple tree that I had my camera on ended up drying up, and the other apple tree still had apples. And so I got in there, and he's on this apple tree, and he, bounded off into the bedding area, and I was like, oh, man, like I just blew my chance at this deer,
Yeah.
a big deer like that.
So he was probably there the whole time.
Yes, he was just beyond my camera 30 yards, you
Yeah.
know. And, I was pretty disappointed, and I'm standing there, and I was like, well, I'm gonna still set up here in this area tonight. So I walked, took about 2 more steps, and there was the 12 point that he was running with was up in the woods about 50, 60 yards, and he took off bounding off. And at this point, I'm just like, man, like what am I like, what am I gonna do now? You know?
Yeah.
So that night, at that point it was getting a little bit dark, not dark, but just not much time to climb up in a tree. So I ended up just getting to a spot where I sat in the ground the rest of the night and just basically watched to see if any other deer came out and to see what was happening. And again, because my camera, even the does and stuff, they stopped showing up on this camera. So I'm trying to think. I went home that night and I looked at the weather and stuff and had the same exact weather for the next day. And just I was like, you know what? Like, what do I have to lose? I'm going to go back in there and see what happens. So I crawled back into that area again. I snuck way out around and got set up in a tree. And I think the first time I saw those deer the night before, they were out at like 5:15. I mean, they're still very early, you know. Well, you know, 5:15 comes around and 5:30 comes around, and you know, I saw some doe but no bucks. I'm like, yeah, they're not going to follow the same pattern they did the night before. And just a little bit disgusted with it, you know, and I'm sitting there, and it was a little after 6 o'clock. I look out into the one, you know, the bedding area. I can see into it a little bit, and I saw the big 12 point walking through at about 70 yards. And, you know, I was like, oh, man, he's not coming this way. He's not hitting up or staging up on the apples like he did the night before. So I'm sitting there, and I'm like, what are the chances this 9 point comes out? And, you know, it wasn't 5 minutes later I saw the 9 point come out of the bedding area there, and he came in and hit that apple tree. And at that point he was about 40 some yards, I think 41, 42 yards. And what he did is he ended up getting on the same trail the doe went on and was heading up to the crop field, the ag fields that are about 400, 500 yards away. And he got on that trail, and I knew exactly it was going to be a 30-yard shot. And he came through and just made a perfect shot on him. And I don't know, he ran maybe 70, 80 yards and had a great blood trail the entire way and recovered him, you know. Thought I heard him crash, and then at the same time, you know, he ran into that thicket. So it's like maybe I didn't hear him crash. Maybe he was just running, you know, because you know how it is. As soon as you hit something, you think you hit it good, but then doubt starts creeping in.
It's crazy what your brain will make you
I know. I'm like,
believe.
I'm like, well, I wasn't as high as I usually am. Maybe I hit him a little bit too high, you know, and, you know, had some doubts creeping in, but called up Nate and my buddy Luke, and we ended up going and finding them there, and had a great blood trail through all that thick stuff, and again just came upon him, and that was the end of the chapter with that deer. You know, he's kind of been a little bit of a legend around the area for the past couple years, between myself and my cousin that hunts him a lot. You know, it hunts in the same area, and so it was pretty rewarding to finally lay hands on that deer. And he's just a big heavy frame 9 point, you know, and couldn't be happier with him for a PA buck.
I think the coolest part of that story, like the biggest takeaway of that story, is the fact that you had a camera and you weren't getting any pictures on it, and that buck and that 12 point were coming out probably every day 30 yards behind that camera.
Oh yeah.
And you know, and it's just like,
well, so for me, that's the biggest takeaway that I took away from it. I think we get too wrapped up with trail camera pictures and when to be into an area based off of trail cameras, and you can't do it. I mean, you're literally your trail camera is covering 20 yards in the woods, you know.
You had in your mind that deer wasn't even in the area.
Yeah, I mean, he disappeared off everybody's trail cameras. So in a way, I know that's a great bedding area where I was at, and there was a lot of guys hunting them. So in a way, I had a feeling he was in that bedding area, but I wasn't positive on it. Because I was relying on the trail camera. And if it wasn't for boots on the ground that night and bumping those deer, I would have never been back in there, to hunt it, So,
I mean, we can probably all agree that trail cameras are very useful, but the amount of deer they probably save, I think, is probably higher than a lot of people want to admit. I know myself, I'm guilty of not hunting a place if I don't get a trail cam picture in that same area. And a few years ago, we proved that we had a super small, I think it was like a 1/16 of an acre food plot that we put in the middle of a lot of thick autumn olive, and we thought, we had what we thought was overkill. We had 3 cell cameras on a 16th of an acre, but we wanted to know every time a deer was in that plot. And my buddy Trent sat in that plot one morning, and he ended up seeing, I think, 15 deer and 3 or 4 different encounters with deer coming out in this food plot, and never once did any of them get on one of the 3 cell cameras we had. And ever since then, we've been second guessing ourselves on, basing anything on trail cameras. I mean, they definitely have their, perks, but
Yeah,
nothing beats getting in the woods.
boots
like
on the
you said.
ground. I mean, for me, we were just so busy leading up to it, to archery season this year, and I was taking my boy hunting a lot, so I actually only got in the woods myself maybe 4 times prior to killing that deer. Every other time I had my boy with me, and easier spots to get to and stuff like that, and places I had access to go with him. But yeah, I mean, I think, going forward in the future, I've never really relied on trail cameras, but I actually relied on them more this year just because I didn't have the opportunity to scout as much as I do in the past. With my one boy, he plays a lot of baseball, so we were gone from May to almost mid-October with traveling with baseball constantly. So that's what I've gathered, though, just not to rely on those things, get in the woods and scout.
You had some history with that buck the year prior. Did you see anything that he did the year before that kind of gave you a heads up on what he may have been doing this year? Or I've heard in the past, guys having 2-3 years of history, makes it a lot easier to kill them. Did you see anything like that, or did you not have that much history with him?
No. 2 years prior, that's where I got him on a scrape, and that deer, the day I had him on a scrape and I passed him up, I took my boy hunting a couple days later, and the way the crow flies, I bet that deer was 1.5 miles away from that spot, dogging a doe out in his field. I was like, oh, he's not going to make it. Then last year, I knew where he was bedding, especially in the rut. It's a real good spot for the bucks that they come down and they bed in this area because there's a lot of doe in this area. And I saw him numerous times, but I don't think any other time I was within 50 yards of him, besides that one time I had him at 27 yards, and he was just kind of sporadic. He wasn't no patterns or anything like that. And that's an area too where I was hunting him that year. I don't get in there until usually I'll do an early season hunt, a mid-October hunt, and then I'll start hitting it a little bit harder, come November 2nd, November 3rd. Again, whenever a lot of those does start coming into heat, I'll get a lot of buck into that one area.
Yes. All right. Well, let's move on to Nate then.
Yeah, so my story kind of begins. We have a camp up north, and probably end of September, beginning of October, my brother-in-law and I put out some cameras, and he put one in an area where there was a lot of white oak, and it just so happened, we didn't know at the time, but the white oak up there don't drop that frequently. Maybe every other couple years you might get a good white oak crop up there, and he put a camera in those white oaks, and it just so happened that they started raining white oaks. And we found that there was a group of bucks that were feeding on these white oaks like crazy. And nothing giant, but maybe 3 to 4 bucks from 110 to 130 inches or something like that, which is, up there. It's all public land, and I consider 120 to 130 inch buck up there to be a good buck. So that's kind of where it started, and I was getting pictures of these bucks up there, and I went up on the first day and I hunted and saw a couple doe. We had to get back. We're in the process of building a new camp, so I went back to camp to work on the new camp for the rest of the day, and this buck actually came past at 6 o'clock on the first day, right exactly where I was sitting. He came past at like 6 p.m. And so that was like the first initial time that I had seen this buck, and didn't really have any other history with him until I got back up there. Would have been October 31st. It was Halloween, and at that point in time, I was hunting just a travel corridor going from one hillside to the next, probably about a mile away actually from these white oaks, and I saw 22 deer that day. We had got a good bit of snow that morning, and I pulled the all day sit, and I saw I think it was around 22 deer, 5 to 6 buck. I had a little 8-point come past, a half rack 4-point, and then right before dark, I caught a glimpse of a really, really good buck about 70 yards away that went through a clearing in this creek bottom. So, I was hunting out of a saddle, and I'd made up my mind that I was going to leave my sticks in the tree that night, my sticks and my platform, and I was going to sit in that same spot until about 10 or 11 o'clock. And if I didn't see, what I wanted to see by then, I was going to move down to that opening where I saw that good buck the night before. And that's exactly what I did. I sat till 11 o'clock and saw one doe that morning, and I thought, I'm moving down there where I saw that good buck the night before. So I moved down there and found a tree. Definitely wasn't the nicest tree, but it was a tree that I was able to get into in the saddle. And I wasn't really high, maybe 14 to 15 feet up. And about a half hour later, I had a spike chase a doe around me, and they got out of there. And then at 1 o'clock, I could hear a deer just running through the woods. And I looked up, and this big doe comes running straight underneath my feet. And where I was sitting, I was on the edge of this creek, and there was a little levee that dropped off before the creek. And this doe came running right down that levee, and I'm talking like maybe 2 yards from the base of my tree. And so I kind of had that feeling. I was like, there's got to be a buck coming. There's got to be a buck chasing her. So I got myself ready. I got my bow, got my release on, and I was kind of set up facing right where she came through. And I was like, man, if there's a buck chasing her, like, I'm shooting this thing straight down. Yeah. And that's exactly what happened. I heard this buck leave a grunt, and it was a really long, drawn-out grunt coming down the valley side. And I drew back, and he came running right underneath me. And when he got to about 15 yards, I started grunting at him really loud to try and get him to stop. And when he came to the base of my tree, he was almost to a stop, just like a slow kind of walk, like, what is that? What? Yeah. And he's trying to figure out what that is. And I just settled the pin and shot, and actually hit him a little bit back, but I knew I made a liver shot on him, and it came out low. And he did a loop around me, and this all happened so fast. Like, from the time I saw this buck to the time that I put an arrow in this buck was seconds. Yeah. And he did this big loop up and around me, and he ended up coming back to about 35 yards, and he's standing there perfectly broadside, just looking around. And I'm like, okay, what's he going to do here? Like, maybe he's going to fall. I don't know. Yeah. And he started kind of getting a little woozy. Like, he was kind of tipping back and forth, and I was like, all right, maybe he's going to fall. And he ended up bedding down. No, I'm sorry. As he's standing there getting woozy, I'm like, you know what? I can get another arrow in this buck. Yeah. So I was looking at him, and as I was looking at him, I went to reach for my quiver, which I had hanging on a limb, and I shouldn't have done that. But when I did that, I bumped the quiver with my hand, and all my arrows go tumbling out of the tree and fell right to the base of the tree. And he didn't move, which I was surprised, but I'm like, are you kidding me? You know? So I'm like looking at my arrows, looking at him, just kind of like thinking, what am I going to do? And he ended up bedding down. And so he was bedded about 35 yards. And I was like, man, this is like the whole time I'm in the tree at this point, I'm like telling this deer I'm sorry for making this shot, because I felt absolutely terrible that I'm going to have to sit here and watch this deer die, which could potentially take a couple hours if he's liver hit,
Yeah.
And so I'm like sitting there just like everything, just all the emotions are going through my head, and I'm telling him I'm sorry, before I even, ended up getting this deer because I hit him back. And so he stands up again, and I'm like thinking to myself, like, what is going to happen here? He's either going to go away or like, what am I going to do? So he ends up standing up, and he walks 5 yards, and he beds down. And when he beds down, his head is behind a tree. So I look down at my arrows, and I'm like, man, I think I can get out of the tree. So his head was behind the tree, and every time the wind would blow, I would climb down the tree a little bit, and then it would get calm, and I would just stay still for a minute, and then the wind would blow, and I'd get down. So I finally got down on the ground without him running, and I got my arrows, and I knocked an arrow, and I got real low to the ground, and I basically crawled down around this levee where he couldn't see me. And I poked up over this knob, and when I poked up over the knob, I could see his body at like 20 yards, and he was just bedded down there. And the way it was, his chest was kind of facing straight at me, and I drew back and shot, and I put one straight up through his chest, and the way that he was angled, it went straight through his chest and actually came out, high in his back. And when I hit that time, I heard, it took the air out of him, and he never even got up out of his bed. And so I knew that I knew he was done at that point. So I kind of just collected myself. I went back to the tree, got my sticks down, got everything down, took some of my heavier clothes off, and walked over. And by the time I got to him, he was expired. And I was hunting about a mile away from where those white oaks were early season, and it was that same 10-point that walked past that night on the first day at 6 o'clock. And so I thought that was really cool, to be able to. I didn't have a lot of history with that deer. I mean, I had some pictures of him, but to kill him, in a travel corridor a mile away from where he was feeding on the white oaks, I thought was really, really cool. And just a great, not a giant buck, but a great mountain buck. I think he had a brow tine busted off, and I think he would have been rated about 120, and I couldn't have been more happy with him.
Yeah.
So. That's
a solid PA buck that most guys aren't passing up.
Yep.
Yeah. Seemed like the theme this year with the acorns were pretty much everywhere in my area. I don't know what all the places you guys hunt. Seemed like every oak tree was loaded with acorns, and it was tough early season. We do a lot of food plotting up at our camp up north, and it was just like someone turned the light switch off, and we weren't having any deer in food plots, so we had to pull an audible and mid-season start diving into some acorns. And it wasn't until maybe about close to Halloween till I started actually finding some deer.
Right. Yeah. So that was the one thing I really noticed at camp this year is like some years we have acorn crops that are just insane. Like, like you might have a red oak that drops so many acorns that the deer will eat those acorns well into late muzzleloader season till after January because there's so many of them.
Yeah.
This year it wasn't like that. This year there was an abundance of oaks that were dropping, but it wasn't a heavy crop. So the deer actually had almost everything cleaned up by mid-October.
Yeah.
There were a couple deer, some bucks that were still eating, focused on the red oaks. They drop a little later, and they were, there was a couple lingering red oaks.
Yeah.
But everything was gone by mid-October, and it was like, just focus on those travel routes and those funnels. That's where they're going to be. So
we primarily hunt in and around a lot of ag, and I was just having this discussion with someone yesterday. There's even to this day, almost December 1st here, and we still have standing corn in a lot of places.
Right.
I don't know if you guys have any experience with that, but we were talking to some of our farmer friends, and they said it had something to do with, obviously the moisture content is why they haven't cut it yet, but they were theorizing on basically the times when we had all the smoke from the Canada fires.
yeah.
don't quote me on any of this science, but it had something to do with the sun wasn't, drying the corn out like it normally would. And so they're basically letting it go longer because it hadn't got the moisture down.
That's interesting.
But we had some issues with that. I think too. Some of the deer were, gravitating towards the cornfields still. So that made a little bit of a difference. But they did finally start cutting about the beginning of rifle season, and I can usually tell because that's when I start getting bears on my cameras again. Whenever the corn's getting cut. So about maybe right after archery, before rifle was when all of a sudden the bears started coming back out and chewing on my trail cameras again. So, but the property that I killed my buck on was one of those where it's 130 acres and it's just all bedding, and it's been one of those properties where we don't really get bucks in the summer, or even early fall for that matter. And it's taken us a while to figure that out, but we would go in and hunt it, all season basically from opening day, just bouncing around trying to find where these bucks might be, and we've came to the conclusion that they just aren't there until Halloween-ish.
I find that a lot too. Spots that are like overly thick.
Yeah.
I think the bucks, they're in velvet at that time of the year and stuff like that. And
that was one of the things that Kip Adams from the National Deer Association mentioned to me at a seminar one time. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, exactly. Because I've had areas like that too. It's just real thick.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, that's ought to be great for bedding, and they're not there early season. And you don't see them there till they're hard horned or later in the season
velvet,
looking for deer or looking for doe.
His theory was that the velvet, their antlers are sensitive and they just plain don't like being in it. And when he said that, I was like, holy smokes, that was a light switch. And because I bet in 5 years on this property we may have 3 or 4 pictures of a buck in velvet, and he'll just pass through, and then
is that the property with all the autumn olive you talked about?
Yes. Yeah, which is
just thick as can be.
Yeah, it's thick and rough all the time. But
yeah, we hunt a lot of that stuff out in Ohio there where we hunt on public, and it's nasty. It's a lot for a deer in velvet to go through. I'd say. Yep.
And on the flip side of that, I think it's perfect fawning grounds for the does, and I often wondered if we always have a ton of does on this property, and I just wonder if the social dynamic, that time of the year, the does don't want any other deer around their little ones. I wonder if maybe the bucks just kind of naturally stay away from it too. But
with the big mature buck too, they won't left alone. They're in the same boat. They're looking to keep to themselves.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, let's hear your buck story, because you mentioned about us, but we know you killed one too.
Yeah, so the property that we were just discussing there, last few years we've found that Halloween sort of the time where we decided we'd start going into it, after a few years of hunting it with really no success. We've shot a couple does like the first week there, but as far as buck sightings, we have this heavily covered with cameras. Like I said, 130 acres. I bet we have 20 cameras on it right now, and with all the autumn olive, there's a little bit of a road system through it, which naturally the deer kind of just use those roads as their trails. So it's a little easier to, I guess, rely on cameras to know if there's deer in the area. So just the last few years of scrapes, we've had them start showing up, the 25th of October, and that's kind of when we start going in there. So started out a little rocky. We have a food plot on the top of this property that I hung my saddle in one evening, and right at last light I had a buck come in, a solid 8-point, and I ended up making a bad shot. I wasn't filming this one, so I can't exactly say what happened, but I just hit him high, and I think I hit him in, below the spine, or above the spine, I'm sorry, and just got very little penetration and very little blood. And I haven't got a picture of him yet, but I spent 2 days looking for him, and I feel like it was just basically a flesh wound. Fingers are crossed that I have him show back up on camera, to confirm that he's still alive. But so I was kind of bummed out about that. But so I got back into another stand November 3rd, and about 9:30. I hadn't seen any deer yet, and it was like a light switch. I started, seeing some action. Had a couple does walk by. At that point, I was focused on a buck. I had multiple bucks on a scrape not too far from where I was, about 30 yards from my stand. And normally I'm the guy that shoots first doe that I see all the time, but I said in my head, I'm like, man, I'm getting too many bucks here. I gotta wait. So I passed up those couple does that walked by, and hoping that maybe a buck would be, in the area. And about 10 o'clock, I just happened to look up on the hillside along the top of the ridge, and he just came running out of the thicket. And I wasn't filming, but I don't know if I would have been able to anyway, because from the time I saw a deer and saw a rack till I had an arrow in him was, like you said with your buck, maybe 3-4 seconds. He kind of just came fast trotting down the hill. I'm not sure if he was just trying to get from one bedding area to the other, because he was just, he wasn't sniffing. He didn't have a doe with him or anything, but he just kind of, just cruising like November 3rd, like you would think. But he was on a trail. I ranged it at 27 yards, had my sight dialed for 25, just kind of keeping that middle ground between the trails that I had in front of me. And he was almost angling down a hill, so he was the hillside in front of me. He almost made him like eye level with me, so I was shooting pretty much straight. And I drew back, and I didn't bleat at this deer to stop him, but I think just him being eye level with me, he caught movement when I drew back, and I'm not sure what happened in my head, but when I shot, he quartered towards me, and I'm not proud of this, but he basically center punched him like square in the chest, like where you had said your second shot went. And like Brian said earlier about your brain trying to tell you something that, something positive. I couldn't even get mine to do that on this deer. It spun around, and it ran towards me for probably 10 yards and then 180'd back where he came from. And all I saw was about 6 inches of the arrow sticking in him. The rest was hanging out, flopping. So a couple days prior is when I hit that other buck. So at this point, I'm ready to sell my bow, ready to quit hunting, the whole 9 yards. I'm thinking I just wounded a second buck, and, I called my buddy, and, he talked me off the ledge, and I got down and, got some of my heavy clothes off and went up to look at this shot site. And there was surprisingly a decent amount of blood. So I did what I do normally on any deer, is I'd call my buddy Josh with the tracking dog experience that he has, and he's probably gets sick of me calling him, because I call him about once a week during hunting season. Hey, what do you think happened here? What would your opinion be? And I told him the scenario and sent him a couple pictures, and he said, man, like, I think that's lung blood. And I'm still at this point, I'm thinking, I could have got lung, but it might only be one lung. So long story short, I decided to take up the trail where the deer went. I felt like I could see far enough ahead of me that I would kind of almost do like a spot and stalk type of thing, maybe to try to get another shot on him. And it was about 50 yards into the track when I started to get a little more confident. There was good blood, and I was finding bubbles in it and stuff. And but I'm still not convinced that I double lunged them. And in my head, I'm planning to put a second arrow in this deer. So I get up onto a little flat where I can start to see down over the hill, and I'm crawling through some autumn olive. I got to go about 20 yards to where I can really see good, and I get a glimpse of what I thought was a deer. So I spent the next 20 minutes moving around this autumn olive like as slow as possible, because the way this deer ended up falling, I thought it was bedded down looking away from me, because he had fell on a branch that kept his head up in like the perfect bedded position. So I'm like, man, I gotta get another arrow in this deer. So I spent 20 minutes weaving in and out of this brush, and when I finally get to where I thought I could shoot again, I realized that he's stiffened up at this point. And at that point, I just laid there and did a little praying and thanking whoever was helping me that day, because I was convinced for the longest time that I was leaving that woods without a deer again.
That's awesome.
And so it ended up being my biggest archery buck so far. But it was a 8-point, and I got him at the taxidermist now. So that was a weight off my shoulders for sure. That didn't start out too promising, but ended up working out. So.
Now, what if you would have walked up to him and shot him again, thinking that he's still alive?
So that's funny. My dad's the first bear my dad killed in Pennsylvania was a couple years back when we had the rifle season, and he had shot it and he hit it back. He basically was just out on a windy day sneaking around a cornfield, and jumped it up and shot it and knew he hit it back. So we left and went to breakfast and gave it 6 or 8 hours, and the patch of woods that it went into was super small. So we kind of just like were sneaking through it, and we got to a spot and Dad's like, bear. And with like, he had never killed a bear in 30 years of hunting. So that was on his bucket list. And as soon as he said bear, without either of us thinking, we both dropped to the ground and shot at this bear again. Well, we got up to it, and he had been dead for hours. So I keep telling people, technically I have shot a Pennsylvania bear, but he was dead 4 hours before that. So, yeah, luckily the taxidermist wasn't too mad that we had a few holes in that one. He was able to sew it up, but yeah, so.
Sweet. That's awesome. Well, while we were here doing this, Jed ended up having to run out, so we're not going to get a chance to hear about his buck season so far.
All right.
I know he hasn't put one on the ground yet. I think he's let a couple good buck walk. He was showing us some pictures of some buck, and they'd definitely be tempting.
We'll wait till he finishes the story, then we'll have him on to finish that.
One thing I can take from this is I got to up my storytelling, because your guys' story sounded way better than my story.
Well, I mean, yeah, you had a big buck come in, and you made a good shot on it, and he died. I mean, yeah. So sorry we can't do that, I guess, but
that's about all.
I wish my story was as short as yours was. Yeah, but yeah, just I've been out trying to get my. I keep on to say girlfriend. She's gonna get mad if I don't call her fiance anymore. But Allison, she's been after it. Had a couple encounters with the bow, and just for whatever reason, we're getting our butts kicked here in rifle season. I think we saw 2 does so far, but we're hoping she gets out of school on time today, and we're gonna get out and try to put down a buck or a doe tonight. So
Yeah, sounds good. Good luck to you guys.
Yeah. You've been taking the kids out and rifle here, or haven't had a chance yet, or?
Yeah, we have. I think we ought to save the rifle hunting for another day.
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah.
That'll be another topic here coming up one of these days, or else we'll be here for another hour talking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds
Just
like a
say
good
it.
idea.
You want to go to lunch.
I do want to go to lunch.
Okay.
That's like the high point of my day.
Okay.
When you look at 300 turkey calls before lunch every day and you're just cutting them, that's all I
Yeah.
can think about.
Hey,
Yeah, that sounds
whatever gets
good.
you through the day.
When I hit
guess.
that like 250 mark, I'm like, oh yeah, it's about 11 o'clock.
50 more till lunchtime.
That sounds good because I think that we can film another one here real soon and probably get into some good topics about rifle season.
Yeah.
That could
Absolutely.
definitely take up some time.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Well, then we'll wrap it up. Thanks, you guys, for tuning in, and be sure to follow us on social media again at cluckcustomcalls.com, and you can use code POD10.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Pod 10, all caps.
For 10% off anything on the website, cluckcustomcalls.com.
All right, guys. Good luck to you out there if you're still hunting.
Let's go get some lunch.
That's it for another episode of the Clucking Around podcast. We thank everybody for listening. Be sure to check us out on all social medias at Cluck Custom Calls and our website, cluckcustomcalls.com.